Well, hello everyone. I'm Dave Cassel, the Executive Director of Carequality, and I'm joined by David Pike from Ready Computing, who is working with us very closely on our aspect of the RCE project that is current right now, and that being developing the QTF. Sorry, Scott, I had a little bit of a chuckle at your expense as you were asking your question of Steve, because I knew that we were going to be up here in 20 minutes talking about the QTF and our vision for it. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to answer your questions. But Carequality, just to give a little bit of additional background, is a subrecipient of the Sequoia Project's cooperative agreement with ONC. And specifically, we have a few tasks that are delegated to us under that process. The first of which is this development of the QHIN Technical Framework. I'll share a little bit more as we jump into the slides here, but we will also then, if all goes as planned, be playing a role in the actual operations of the QHIN network, for lack of a better word, for this ecosystem. Similar to the one that we play today with Carequality implementers in terms of monitoring QHIN applications and activities and approving applications and those sorts of things. So some parallels there with what Carequality does today, but I'd like to also welcome belatedly, sorry I should have done this initially, those who were joining us for the first time. I think many have been here the whole time, but there may be some folks who are joining us for the Carequality annual meeting, which because of Carequality's role in the RCE project overlaps here with this session. So welcome to any folks who just arrived for the afternoon for Carequality. But with that, I am going to be using paper, which I never use when speaking, so bear with me as I manage that process. But I have questions. Marianne indicated that we were looking for feedback, and we absolutely are. The primary aim in this session is in fact to gather feedback. So if you thought you were going to be listening to us talk a lot about the QTF, I hope that's not the case. We can do that, but we'd really like to be hearing from you. And we do have a number of questions that we can ask. We're going to be providing context around those questions, but if you have questions back for us as well as feedback, we want to see long lines at the mics. And so some of you who are used to participating in Carequality work groups, if you just want to stand up at and be ready at the mics already, you can certainly do that. But just by way of warning, I'll probably talk for a couple more minutes before we get to the questions. So one thing I know folks may feel like the process here is maybe a little bit more formal. You may have some hesitation to provide feedback because you may go back and think about it over a drink tonight and your opinion may change. Please don't hesitate to provide feedback. We completely understand that we're just kind of throwing questions out there for the group. Think of this as being more like a Carequality work group and just speak your minds. And we'll be taking notes and we'll assimilate all of that. And if you change your mind, you can just email us and we'll update what we took note of or add anything else. Excuse me, onto that. As Marianne indicated, we are also going to be having a fully, I mean, not that this isn't public, it was certainly open to the public, but a public webinar next week as a sort of official listening session where we will have a little bit more structured opportunities with the RTI team to gather feedback. You will discover that there are some similar questions that we plan to ask. But that said, certainly feel free to join that webinar in addition to being here today. And if opinions percolate over the next week, you can certainly feel free to share things with us on that webinar as well. But we're really looking forward to a little bit of a hopefully less formal environment here in the family, as it were, and having some debate here and really hearing from the group that has joined us for the meeting. So with that, a little bit about the QTF, and Steve shared some of this already, but basically the QTF outlines the technical specifications that will allow QHINs to meet their obligations under the MRTCs and the ARTCs, and specifically how they will accomplish the exchange paradigms, the QHIN query and the QHIN message delivery. The common agreement obviously will require compliance with the QTF. It wouldn't be very effective otherwise. But as Steve noted, and as many of us commented, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have all the technical specs within the actual contract language itself, which is why it's broken out here into the QTF. The ONC did publish their initial draft of the QTF along with the TEFCA 2, I believe, TEF draft 2. It was QTF draft 1, not to be confusing about all of that. So we are working on what is now the proposed QTF draft 2. And we actually have a pretty good start on that that we've done by borrowing a bit from what Carequality already has in place, and more on that as I get here to the next slides. One additional note that I wanted to get out there, and I didn't really know where else to put it, it's a little bit of a non sequitur on this slide, but bear with me. The QTF philosophically is going to focus, at least as we envision it, primarily on QHIN to QHIN transactions, and will try as much as possible to be agnostic to what happens within a QHIN. That said, acknowledging that there may be some things that we do need to specify what happens at more of a participant and participant member level, because otherwise it wouldn't work at the QHIN to QHIN level if you didn't have something in place. But as much as possible, we really want to try to be agnostic to what happens within a QHIN. So if you just keep that in mind as we're talking through everything that we discuss here. All right, so with that, let's jump into the actual exchange paradigms and the questions that we have. So by way of a little bit of background on QHIN query, the MRTCs require that QHINs support this exchange paradigm. The idea is that you're requesting information in either a targeted or general broadcast fashion, and really the general broadcast is just a targeted query to everyone, where everyone is a target in some ways. That is really all the MRTCs say, though, about QHIN query. You are requesting information from another party. There is not a particular standard or technical approach that is mandated in the MRTCs, and don't expect there to be one. QTF draft 1 did envision that QHIN query would be accomplished by the SOAP-based IHE transactions that Carequality, and for that matter many others, use in production today for document exchange specifically. We do propose to build further on that requirement, or proposal rather, and flesh out the sort of skeleton that was there around those IHE profiles in the QTF draft 1 by having heavy reliance on what already exists for Carequality. So effectively what we're planning to do, and actually have a pretty good draft of this already done, is to take the Carequality requirements in their details and port them over into the definitional structure and language of the MRTCs to serve as the QTF's basis. Now, there are some things where there are some elements that are in Carequality that looking back and reflecting, we're like, well, why do we do that? That we may take the opportunity to tweak a few things around the edges. But for the most part, we're really planning on the QHIN query, at least with respect to the SOAP-based IHE transactions, largely mirroring what Carequality has in production today. We do have, that said, we have a number of questions and are really looking for your feedback. So I will start out with the questions. There we go. And we'll rely on Dave here, my colleague, to help me when I get into uncharted technical waters from my standpoint. I know enough to be dangerous on many topics, but we'll defer to him at times. But first off, and we'll start off with the easy questions, and we'll work our way up to things like FHIR and patient matching and all those good things that people probably want to talk about. But of some interest to us is I mentioned earlier, taking the opportunity to address some things that were in the Carequality specs that we maybe wish were a little different. Along those lines, one thing that's fairly straightforward that we can do is update the version of the IHE specs that we point to. Right now, Carequality points to a very old version of the IHE profiles. we'd like to take this opportunity and in the QTF point to the most recent version of the IHE profiles for XCPD and XCA, for those who are aware of those acronyms. And my question is, does anyone have any objection to that? Is there a reason why we should not do that? Interested in your feedback on that question.
I'm just curious why you wouldn't also consider MHDS, given the burden it so adds in a lot of cases for setup and that sort of thing.
At the first part, we really wanted to keep it as simple using existing technologies. Right now, XCA, XCDR, these technologies are already in place. Pretty much every HIE can already send a document, receive a document through the XCA profiles. So in order to expand it, and we have questions. We have questions as to what we should add for version 1. But we really wanted to keep it so that when we get a QHIN interested, we're not saying, okay, well, we know what you've got and what you can do. However, here's 500 requirements where it's simply, not ready.
Well, let me follow up with that and say, does it have to be limited to just the SOAP-based IHE, or could you have both? Just a question.
Yeah, that's question 3. Come on. No, the answer is that we do want to hear thoughts on whether we should expand that, and if we are going to expand, should we really focus only on document exchange via other technologies, or should we look at FHIR support more broadly? And with that, my personal view, and obviously this is subject to a great deal of process and feedback and everything else, but for what it's worth, my personal view is that FHIR support of various types is a question of when rather than if. But is that the right thing to do for the first version of the QTF for production use? I think is really the question that we're
well, and to be clear, I wasn't asking for full FHIR. The MHDS is really just around the document sharing paradigm, right? So.
Well, MHDS is still in comment, so I mean, it is very early. I mean, having MHD, having PICS MPDQM, those kind of things supported is a question we have later. But MHDS hasn't even gone out for full comment.
That's fair. I just said MHDS to sound like I was au courant.
I can do 3-letter acronyms with the best of them.
Yeah, Matt?
Hi, Dave. So I don't have any, I'm all with you. Just a thought while I was sitting there. So bear with me for a second. When I teach about standards, I talk about, I go back to Archie Cochran, who was the Cochrane Collaborative developer, and he was a Brit, and he said the 2 best things about America were jazz and Medline, or PubMed. And I add now the Interoperability Standards Advisory. Why don't you just link all your references back to the ISA? It's great. Simple, it's maintained, it's brilliant. We should start pushing people there. That's what I would do.
Well, and I really appreciate that feedback. I think the concern that we would have, and for that matter, the reason why we are taking some of the Carequality specs and adding them on top of what was already in QTF Draft 1 is that simply saying use IHE XCA is not sufficient. There are some other constraints that we want to put in place.
I'm not sure if this is the right time for this question or not, but Dave, you said just stand up whenever. So Bill Howard, and I wanted just to ask if the XCA XCPD paradigm works with considering a multi-hop scenario where you're going to have, the first degree querying your local node, and then that is going to query the QHIN, and then you're going to end up with all these broadcasts going out. I'm just wondering kind of how XCA XCPD is going to work in that world, and does there need to be some tweaks in that regard?
I'll take a first crack at that, and then Dave, I'm interested in your thoughts as well. I think one, as far as how the first order entity actually ends up initiating the transaction, that would not even have to be XCA, XCPD. That could be a whole host of things that we don't necessarily care about, along the lines of that being agnostic to what happens within a QHIN. Once it gets up to the QHIN would then one way or another, take that and either pass along or create the appropriate XCA transaction, which admittedly then would also have to be looked at on the other side to see, is this targeted at the entire QHIN? Is this targeted at a particular set of organizations, and how should that be handled? But with that somewhat meandering response, I'll turn it over to Dave here for some more detail.
XDS is already set up to handle site to site as well as multiple destinations. You have the XDS affinity domain. If I go too deep into TLAs, please stop me. Doing hop to hop is fairly simple because QHIN will be a pass-through for the query. So what will happen is they will receive the query saying, hey, I need a document regarding this patient. Do a lookup across, the QHINs, assuming, it's a generalized query. If it's targeted, we just go to where we need to. That will say, I need to talk to, that will go out to all the QHINs. All the QHINs will go to their members and say, hey, or, do you have information on this patient based on these demographics? Now that could be, we have a question later on whether that should go to the participants or that stays in the QHIN level, but we'll leave that for now. Comes back, and then, again, targeted XCA query going out, and then it's sent out to whoever needs to. It is amalgamated where necessary by the QHINs using the XDS affinity domain option, and then sent back to the original so that you get one big list of documents. And then, of course, that gets sent to the original initiating participant, which gets sent back to participant member, which gets sent back to somebody's desk. They pick which ones they want, and they can pull in whatever documents they need. So really doing the multi-hop system is fairly simple because all you're doing is spreading it out based on, hey, where do you have information? So if, I have my home in Michigan, I have my summer home in Arizona, I have a wonderful piece of property in Florida that I go to. No matter where you are, we just spread it out saying, who's got information on Dave Pike, who lives here? And everybody comes back and says, I do. And then we just go through a normal XCA query exercise through the multi-hop system, which is primarily passed through at that state.
I don't intend to make every other comment, but something you said brought up, and maybe you're talking about this later, but the first TEFCA came out and didn't talk much about record locator services, and the second one came out and it still said that you could have it at the QHIN or you could allow your HINs to do it. And while you said the technology could support that sending out to everybody, there were comments about, I think the term they used were broadcast storms and issues like that. And I'm wondering if that's being rethought at all.
I really would appreciate you jumping ahead questions. We're not at that question yet.
We will certainly be talking about record location. And actually, the specific point you raised of should we require, well, to back up a little bit and jumping ahead myself a little bit, but the MRTCs do have in place a functional outcome of record location. Don't necessarily state whether that has to happen in the QHIN or not as a record locator service. We have the question of should we in fact go back to where I think it actually was in the first draft of the TEF, where it did require there to be a record locator service of sorts, rather than thinking that it can work to federate this out within a QHIN. For what it's worth, my personal preference is still to offer flexibility because of cases that we may not be thinking of, but in an awful lot of the most common cases, it's hard for me to imagine the functional outcome that is demanded by the MRTCs being successfully achieved without having record location for large QHINs. For what it's worth, but not to preempt the feedback when we ask that question later. But John, go ahead.
Specifically to your question about adopting the latest specification, I'd like to express support. Currently, a lot of the links to specification in some of the implementation guides are actually dead. So it's a lot of confusion to try and dig back into archaeological times.
The IHE website has a lovely archive section which has all the technical frameworks going back to the dawn of time.
Makes it challenging.
Yeah. Alan?
So can I ask a more, I guess, foundational question as we're getting into all of these questions about the QTF? So as others have expressed kind of in comments and things that have been discussed in the past with everything that's going on with TEFCA, a lot of what is asked for in cures is satisfied or is the direction that Carequality is already going. And Carequality is already handling a lot of what is needed. Along come TEFCA, and it introduces QHINs and these different ways of communication and what QHINs have to do and who they have to be, and it greatly overcomplicates things. But that's kind of just the direction that we're saying, okay, well, we have to start figuring all of this out. Dr. Rucker made a comment in his discussion that I thought was interesting because I hadn't heard that said before, but his comment was that the idea of QHIN is kind of just what they put out there, but they didn't necessarily intend that it had to stick that way, and that the RCE has a lot of control over what the QHINs actually look like. So my question from a more foundational perspective is, Carequality is already doing a lot of this. Is there an intention that the RCE will modify the definition of QHIN to be more in line with Carequality, or are all of our future questions in this session here based on the idea that we're going to stick with what ONC proposed the QHINs to be, even though it is overly complicated from what's needed?
Well, I'll refrain from commenting on some of your more editorial elements there, but I will probably need to get a little bit more background on exactly what Dr. Rucker meant this morning as well, when he said that. What I think he was trying to convey, and I shudder at the thought of speaking for him, but I think he was probably trying to convey the general flexibility that exists and the willingness to listen and respond to feedback that Mary Ann was alluding to as well. My understanding is that the concept of the QHIN, and think about it in its sort of the most general sense as being, from the Carequality equivalent of it, is it just being like an implementer, that something like a QHIN, in fact, is reasonable to exist and is going to exist, and that is not going to fundamentally change. Whether there necessarily has to be a QHIN that underneath it has participants that are themselves HINs, or can a QHIN directly work with who would maybe be participant members. My sense is that there can be some flexibility there in that model, that there will be participants or there will not be, depending on whether they're valuable in particular situations. And I do expect that there will be participants who arise, and I'm not sure exactly which elements of the QHIN definition were necessarily behind some of your comments, but my sense is that the QHIN concept is there to stay, and there may be some room to certainly, if there's feedback on the definition, I think we'll want to hear that as well, perhaps in the MRTC session, an ARTC session here after the break. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I guess just as far as saying QHIN equals implementer is one thing, right? That's just a terminology, and we can say, yeah, if you're an implementer, you would be a QHIN, but there are requirements around what QHINs must do and who they must be that don't line up with what implementers on Carequality necessarily do today. So there are implementers like No2 and Redox and Commonwealth and others that essentially are what the QHIN is asked to be and have connections underneath them, but then you also have Epic, and where they're not actually a QHIN, they have their individual participants are all individually addressable with their own gateways, which is not in line with what the QHINs are required to do. So are we requiring that everyone be under a QHIN, or can the definition of QHIN be modified such that it is more in line with an implementer, where a participant may be individually addressable without having to connect through a QHIN? The intermediaries aren't necessarily needed. We've shown that in Carequality, but intermediaries are what the TEFCA calls for today.
Well, one of the reasons for that, I think, and you know, some of this starts to get into policy questions that from the QTF standpoint we take as given. But Carequality also does not have the functional outcome requirements, let alone the literal requirement, of record location service by an implementer in the Carequality case. So to the extent that you expect that functional outcome and you do expect to have a single gateway, I do think that that's at least in the IHE SOAP profile world, I think that single gateway is a desired policy outcome. I mean, we could certainly have discussion on that as well, and I'm sure that ONC would be interested in feedback, but I think that is a policy expectation at this point. Given that, I think some of the QHIN complexities as you're characterizing them relative to the implementer probably stem from that expectation of there in fact being a single gateway and there being that functional outcome of record location.
Sure. And so I guess my question would just be, are we open to looking at other ways that can be accomplished, or are we sticking with the idea of there has to be this intermediary QHIN? Because there are already record locator services, there are ways that could be accomplished without everyone having to go through an intermediary gateway.
Good feedback is always welcome.
We really need to move on to question two.
Yeah, well, we aren't really on question one, but that's okay.
But we've got an answer to question one. We should move to question two.
Yeah,
we've only been up half an hour.
We should. So the question two, and those at the mics get a free chance to respond to question two. It is similar, but even more specific in some ways than the first question. In the Carequality specs, specifically for SAML tokens, we point to the NHIN authorization framework. The QTF draft 1 had proposed IHE XUA as the standard for SAML tokens. My understanding is that they're actually extremely similar. But we are planning somewhat along the lines of again, going with the more current specification of going with the IHE XUA profile as suggested in QTF draft 1. So that probably wasn't what anyone was coming up to the mic to comment on, but if someone who wants to we'll take your questions and then just have that in the back of your mind as well, that we're interested in that SAML token spec.
My question is really higher level strategic, so I'd like to use the analogy of the railroad industry. When other means of transportation were coming along, like cars and aircraft, the railroad industry said, we're a railroad industry, and we build railroads and we communicate with railroads, and we're not transportation. We are railroads. And so I'm sitting here thinking, why are we talking about SOAP when fire is on the forefront? We are in a fundamental game-changing paradigm shift right now of the opportunity to go to RESTful APIs and to really facilitate a nationwide highway, and yet we're talking about technology that's more than 20 years old. And so I really want to ask that as a big question about what are we really looking at? Are we just coming up and saying we're a railroad industry and we're going to build another railroad and a faster way to communicate with those railroads? Are we looking at, we want interoperability, we want something scalable, we want something RESTful, we want modern technology, and we can make those changes now. So that's, the question is, why aren't we talking about alternatives to our past?
The flippant answer to your question is that's question 3, not question 2. But
I've always said the wrong question. It was 1, it was 2, it was SAML, is it Olaf? Okay.
No, I mean, in all seriousness, somewhat, as I said earlier, I think the question of fire is when rather than if. From a practical standpoint, in Carequality, when we originally were looking at specifications, granted this was at a time when fire was not realistic. It was starting to emerge, but really was not plausible at that time for what Carequality wanted to do. But the IHE SOAP profiles were meeting the industry where it was at. And I think that's a little bit of what we're looking at here as well. How can we get adoption right away? There are questions to be answered about how fire would work in this QHIN type of paradigm. And you know, lots of other things that are at a practical level about standardizing resources and looking at all of these sort of non-fire elements that go into a fire ecosystem, which is exactly what our Carequality fire work groups are working on. There's some similar, hopefully complementary work that's underway in the FAST initiative through ONC. All of that work, I think, needs to be allowed to happen. However, that is the next question, is when is the right time for fire to be
Well,
brought
and
into
then the
picture?
question is, why aren't we thinking in terms of the bridge then? If we're thinking, we're a railroad, how do we become an aircraft? You know, what do we need to put, what rails do we need to put in place, or not rails in place, to be able to do that? So I just want to pose that question. It's not, it's strategic, it's a bigger thing, but I think we have to be thinking about not just 5 years, but 10 years down the road. What is the world going to look like? It's not going to be soap. It's not soap today. So,
Maybe, if I would. Yeah. The biggest problem with implementing fire right now is it's in flux. We have a handful, sorry, I own the fire consent resource, so I'm a big fan of fire. But there are very few, only really the patient resource is normative, right, is unchanging. We will be working with documents and all kinds of information flowing back and forth, encounters and such. All of those are still in flux. If you look at the TEFCA draft 2, it actually pointed you to the fire build, which is suicide if you try to implement it because it changes daily. Once R5 comes out, R5 is going to have a lot more normative resources. At that point, it is much more likely that wide-scale implementation can happen. At this point, using the IHE, MHD profile, that kind of thing is functionally possible because it's using things that are tightly constrained. So even if the core resource changes, we have the profile saying this is what it should look like. So we can't really move to a full fire stack, to a full open fire implementation yet. R5 may make that possible. It may be R6 before that's really possible for what we need to do. Well, yes, but then we need software implementations, which will be a year and a half out from there.
Rob?
I don't have comments on the SAML. Sorry. Gonna go in another direction again?
Well, if nobody has an opinion, then we'll just use XUA. But go ahead.
Well, someone might, but anyways. One of the flexibility things about Carequality is the technology framework isn't prescribed necessarily, and one of the challenges we ran into is with the variability, some systems maybe are configured one way that causes them to be a little bit slower to respond than maybe another system that's very quick. And when you have, we do this today, where you hit maybe multiple 5, 10, 30, sometimes that slower responder can cause backups and bottlenecks and everything else that happens. The question I have is, if we're going to be prescribing a technology framework in the QTF and saying this is how you shall do it, how are you going to kind of validate and test bed and saying, oh, this is scalable, because scalability is what we're all here talking about. What are the plans around kind of validating the QTF model will be scalable and kind of work in that way?
It's a good question. I'm open to your ideas for how we can, at a practical level, test from a scalability standpoint. That said, what we are going to plan to do is keep scalability in mind throughout all of the process. So for example, for exactly those reasons that you raised, given the expectation of a functional outcome of record location, of being able to go to a QHIN and say, hey, where are all the records for Rob Klotwijk? If I expect that as a functional outcome, is there any way to actually successfully achieve that in a scalable fashion if there isn't an MPI at that QHIN that can tell me exactly where Rob's records are? If you're expecting to be able to federate that out within a QHIN and take a query and then say, oh, this is a query for Rob, 35 participants, tell me if you have Rob, 33 of those may come back very quickly, and the same thing could happen with documents and everything else, and then the other two could be the limiting factor there. So how we set that up and how we handle that record location and the patient lookup question, I think is going to be pretty fundamental for scalability. You feel free to respond.
I don't have a magical solution for testing scalability in this type of prescribed framework.
Let's explicitly ask for feedback on fire. I mean, we've certainly gotten one, actually probably more than one opinion already, that we should be looking to move towards support for fire-based transactions. And I think really the most important question is, again, not necessarily is that going to be a direction, but when is the right time for that direction? Is the next draft, so again, out for public comment at some point in 2020, as Steve was saying, is that draft the right time to try to do a full set of fire support? Would it be better to look only at a narrow slice of document exchange via fire? What do folks think as far as that timing? Is it the right time, or does there need to be a little bit more maturity from fire? And Kedar, you don't necessarily have to answer that question directly.
Yeah, so I just want to continue what Rob said. QTF prescribing something, but my assumption is TEFCA is saying it should be voluntary and non-prescriptive. So does it not, is it not in contrary to what Congress has asked? So how do they both come together when we define QTF, which is more prescriptive, or am I missing something here?
Well, I mean, the QTF, in order to actually be functional, is going to have to be relatively prescriptive. You have to be as specific as possible. Setting aside exactly what we specify, you have to specify the language that people speak to one another. Otherwise, it's all going to break down. So they're, not being prescriptive from a technology standpoint is good up to a point, but you also need it to work. And so at some point, you need to specify the technical standards.
So the assumption that it's a voluntary and non-prescriptive is not necessarily true. What Congress.
And I'm sorry, I think I'm not understanding a key word you're saying in the very beginning there.
So the point is, my assumption is Congress said it is voluntary and non-prescriptive, and in QTF we are saying it is prescriptive.
So the prescriptive versus non-prescriptive, I think again, what we're looking at in the QTF is a way to make it possible for the requirements of the MRTCs to be met by the QHINs. So that does, given those policies, there are some things that we need to do on the technical side, and there may be multiple ways that one could theoretically do them, but we have to pick one or it just isn't going to work. From the voluntary side, and sorry, that was the word that I wasn't understanding, it all, to the best of my knowledge, remains voluntary. Now, there may or may not be other federal programs that ultimately would point to this work in some way, but there's no expectation that this is somehow mandatory. Yeah, Ryan?
To your fire question.
Thank you.
We, as of October 1st of this year, depending on the ONC stats, 70 to 80% by market share of the health systems have the patient-facing fire API live in production. So I think the question is, we have an opportunity of looking at that, and to your point about maturity, yes, they're not all there yet. I think the question isn't necessarily, I think there's a question on timing, but there's also a question on whether it's the same process. So as we think about it in the Cairn Alliance, we think about it in terms of, yes, we've got to provide support for fire, but there's all types of other things, APIs, internet-based economy, new networks, privacy, security, OAuth, all of the other things that are wrapped up into kind of a new way in which the data gets exchanged, that it potentially may be a new and somewhat, emerging process that may not need to be complicated with the current way in which the data gets exchanged as well. So we may want to think about looking at this as kind of just a different way of exchanging the information that would be implemented over time as the industry matures.
And interpreting and extrapolating a little bit, is there a suggestion that if we're looking at fire, there may not necessarily need to be the same sense of all transactions having to route through the QHIN?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, look, this is going to be an iterative process over the next decade, right? That's the reality of the situation. This is not going to be a flip of the switch. So how do we support an iterative process by the industry to move towards fire transactions over the next decade, which is going to include providers, hospitals, and health plans, to make that transition? And how does Carequality kind of look to support that? There's this mirroring of the current way in which we're thinking about doing TEFCA, et cetera, but there's also this transition into this new internet-based economy of RESTful APIs that looks at a totally different way of exchanging information. There's a question of, are they two separate processes? There's a question of when and how do you merge those two processes, and when and how do you actually provide oversight for those going forward?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so, and I think that part of what my comment is really around, you're creating an entity that doesn't exist today. So a QHIN doesn't exist, right? So right now, I'm a member of the eHealth Exchange and Carequality to facilitate my exchange, as well as the EHR vendor that we use. So I think that as you create the rules, you need to include the flexibility that as standards emerge, they can be part of it. You don't care what happens behind the QHIN, so whether it's fire or V2, HL7, or whatever. I think that what we design here needs to be flexible enough to that gentleman's point, is that as standards emerge and as that connectivity is the requirement for me to come through a regional entity or a qualified health information network to transact, to do these transactions, and I know that's not the technical piece of the framework, that's more of a policy side, but I think that that's where the technical flexibility needs to be in place to support those existing and emerging standards, and they need to be part of that technical framework from a support standpoint. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. And just to one of the points that you made there, almost in passing, I mean, somebody can throw something at me from the audience if I'm wrong here, but I don't think there's anything in the policy proposals that says thou shalt connect for TEFCA purposes through a regional entity per se. There will presumably be regional entities that play various roles in the ecosystem, but I don't think there's necessarily a very structured single path that one has to take as a provider organization to participate in the TEFCA ecosystem, for what it's worth. Stephen?
I'm still sort of reeling from Ryan's comment. It almost sounded like you were saying, don't rush to support fire on the TEFCA. I'm not sure that's what you meant.
Yeah, reframe that.
May I have a privilege? Point of personal privilege, please. No, I was saying that we have existing standards, we have emerging standards, right? There's a world that is going to exist where we're moving from existing to emerging. That will always be the case. All I was saying, and we want to get to emerging, absolutely, I think the world wants to get there. The question is, how do we do it? I was just posing the question, how do we do it? Do we do that in trying to take the existing, get the existing up and running, and trying to modify it for emerging? Or do we actually take a totally separate process and say, we're going to create an emerging process for what this looks like so it can be more flexible because it is emerging by definition? That's actually all I was trying to say.
And thank you, and sorry, I think there's an interesting point that the folks who are madly taking notes to capture. To paraphrase what I think you're saying is that there may be a, QHINs must support the existing standards, but if two QHINs wanted to do their communication through an emerging standard, we should have a way for that to be permitted and hopefully as seamless as possible with as little pre-coordination as possible, but allow that to occur. Cool, okay.
And to rephrase your rephrase, I think what you're saying is that a QHIN doesn't have to exclusively do QHIN business according to the framework, that they could have other business, as you were just describing, in addition.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that is certainly true. I wouldn't anticipate there again, somebody could throw something at me from the audience if I'm wrong here, but I wouldn't anticipate the rules prohibiting a QHIN from having a second lives, if you will. But what I was suggesting is that this actually would be part of their role as a QHIN, a way for them within that role as a QHIN to use emerging standards.
Which is consistent with how ONC sees standards, that you can always go above and beyond. The reason I stood up here was to try to answer your original very simple question, which I thought I heard you ask, which is when we start doing fire on the TEFCA, would it be reasonable to just do documents via fire as a starting place? And my personal opinion is it would be nice to simultaneously be able to do small resources in addition to documents. It would be a shame to spend a whole development cycle just doing fire-based documents and then have to come back and do resource requests. So I'd personally rather see them go forward in parallel.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, we were looking at the first step, doing MHD, doing the IHE document profiles using fire. And like I said, it's right now with only patient really being normative. There are others, but I mean, it's things like bundle and the backbone stuff. Thank you. Thank you. Observation is also normative. Fine. It makes it difficult when you have things like when you want to send encounters and medications and all of these where you can have they're still allowing breaking changes. So that if R5 comes out and medication is not yet normative, do we stick with that one? And then when R6 comes and it is normative and there's a breaking change between, that means there's a lot more development needing to be done. And that's the biggest issue about real fire stack activation. Fire document exchange, that's fine. We send document reference and we're good. So it's just a matter of how mature do you want the standard to be before you implement it. And with fire being randomly mature, I don't know how else to put that. So some are normative, some are, maturity level 1. Where do you set the stick to say, okay, we're going to move forward with this?
It would seem using normative would be a reasonable.
Which, I mean, you're going to have a significant number of normative resources in R5, and then we just have to let the software catch up.
So I think the term from
that's question 12.
Hey, my company paid good money to send me. I think the term that others have alluded to is willing partners, and on testing fire and what you may want to do with it to not exclude willing partners doing the work you mentioned, like 2 QHINs doing work. The one thing I did want to mention from a technical perspective is when you're talking about the record locator service, when you add fire resources, you've added a complexity to that record locator service that needs to be thought about.
Absolutely true.
Thank you. I don't know who was next.
Why don't you have patient matching and record location up. Why don't we've got 7 minutes left.
Mine's a patient matching question.
That partially, I think we actually have more like 20 minutes left. But
Okay,
go ahead.
Patient matching. So other standards like direct, we can ID proof a patient, sign pairs of cryptographic keys, have unique identifiers for patients, match them across organizational boundaries based upon a key that can be recognized. So I am challenging the whole thought of matching up patients with what I believe is pretty convoluted, saying, oh, what's the address, what's their date of birth, because those things we know really don't always work, right? And if we actually created a cryptographic keys that uniquely tied to that patient, then we could use those for non-reputable matching of identity across the healthcare system.
That's a national patient identifier.
That's correct. The Senate has removed that requirement that is prohibited. It is now no longer prohibited by law.
And fair enough on all of that. I mean, I think there are God help me if I'm standing up here and defending patient lookup via demographics matching. But again, you know, there's the pragmatic need of meeting the industry where it's at and actually getting something off the ground while we certainly are.
Used in direct today. In direct trust today.
I don't know, Scott, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that for a patient matching solution, but
it's really a valid idea to try and get it right to begin with. I think that is a valid idea to try and get patients identified to start. That is not a crazy idea. I think it's a really good one. However, I do agree with the fact of the matter is today that the way we're doing it is the same way we did it when I first installed an MPI system in '98, and we're doing it at exactly the same level of success, at about 90% at its best. Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, started out with 20% duplication in their system of record, and when we were done, we got to, you know, we improved it by about 5 with the best technology available then, and that is really not very different than technology available today. So I do think there's an opportunity for improvement here, but I also don't think it's reasonable to assume that we've got it totally figured out. I think we have work to do there. So I'm actually very much interested in what the new age record locator service looks like. I don't think that we've got the perfect record locator service defined. I think our MPI model is terrible. So I think if we can come up with a different approach, I think that's good. I do think it will be based on identity proofing and not on a national identifier that is issued by the government by one that might be portable. I don't think that's actually impossible to do. I do think there's an analogy in direct. I'm not sure we do it exactly today, but we do part of it. So what I would suggest is that I do think it's important. And what I would say is that whatever veneer the MRTCs represent, they need to support these changes as they come forward. So I think to your point, I think what's needed is the MRTCs and the TEF need to remove any reference to things that are assumptions of our current technological environment. They should be strictly legal concerns. If the MRTCs do that, then they're a veneer that does the right thing, and then allow us to kind of enhance technology as it goes along, because one thing we can be certain is that technology is going to improve. I mean, we've seen tremendous change in the internet in a decade. I mean, we're going to see that kind of change in what we're doing, I'd like to hope. And the MRTCs, as they first came out and as they second came out, still felt pretty like they were pointing at too much that already exists, I think, to Ryan's point. So trying to take a thinner veneer instead of going too deep would be my thought.
And for what it's worth, there's certainly nothing in the MRTCs that says thou shalt do patient demographics matching the way we've always done it. There's an expectation, obviously, that you have some way to look up patients, and that isn't even explicitly stated. It's just inherent in what you're expected to do from a functional outcome standpoint. But there is nothing in there that that would be in the common agreement that locks in some sort of patient matching technology per se. And the standards that are in use, and I think the same would be true of doing lookup for a fire patient resource as well, would allow you to use IDs, would allow you to use things other than just name, sex, date of birth, et cetera. So I think the specifications allow you to, as the industry is able, to move fairly seamlessly into using some other approaches.
Hi, Ben Moskowitz with the Pew Charitable Trust. Thanks very much for bringing up patient matching, because I think everyone in this room knows better than I do that if we can't get patient matching right, all of this kind of falls apart. I'll also say that when I talk about patient matching, I'm generally going to be talking about, with the patient's consent or when we're already doing matching today, how can we optimize it? So I think there's kind of two approaches to be taking. One is really forward-looking, like the things that Ryan talked about, using biometrics, et cetera. And the other, which is building and maybe slightly amending what you said, which is meeting the industry roughly where it is today. And so if we're already going to be leveraging the demographic data that are in EHRs, there's two opportunities to make progress. I'm curious how much you're looking toward those two areas. So one is with address, we're already using it, but there are ways to optimize it, specifically with the use of the USPS standard. So we did research.
Believe it or not, that's question 6.
Well, let me fully endorse USPS standards. So we did research with Regenstrief. It's a 3% bump, getting you from like 85 to 88% if you use it, coupled with a standard for last name can get you up to 10% bump. We looked at other standards, they weren't helpful. So highly encourage you to do those 2 things, or standardize on address. The second thing is use other data that's already in the health record, like email. It's in already more than half of health records, but typically not used for matching. So adding that to the expectations that should be used when it's available would also go a long way, along with some of the other demographic data that's available. Thanks.
Thanks. And I'll take that as a response on question 6. So that's excellent.
Genevieve.
Hey, Genevieve.
So quick on the patient matching unique identifier stuff. 1, House removed the ban. Senate has not. It is unlikely that that is going to happen this year because of the current state of appropriations. So that being said, question for you guys, since you are grant funded by HHS, can you guys do anything around a unique identifier within the TEFCA structure? And if that's not a question you guys have already asked, it should be a question that goes to OGC to find out whether or not, like what bindings you guys have around that. Because I think that's going to obviously impact what we're able to do around matching within the network.
I laugh not because that was a bad question, but just because I'm like,
Great
oh,
question.
bleep, I should have thought of that.
No, it's okay. But if you guys haven't talked about that already, I think it would be really helpful as a level setting, because if OGC just says, no, that's the same as propagating by HHS, you know, it's a done conversation, right? That's not something we can talk about. But if they don't say that, I think there's room for us to talk about what could be done within the network around unique identifiers.
Yeah, and I don't think we've really done anything there yet. But that said, you know, Mike, I think we'll probably ask that question. Fair enough. Thanks, Genevieve. So we've gotten, I think, a decent amount, excuse me, of feedback on fire and on record location. One more comment, and then I absolutely need to ask at least one question on message delivery. But go ahead, Sharon.
Okay. Just on the unique identifier, been floating this for a long time. Why not a voluntary identification? I think the vast majority of individuals would much prefer accurate connectivity on their own data for their own purposes and for their care. And it wouldn't, you know, if you can talk about it, to Genevieve's point, I think, and QHINs taking on that role so that it doesn't bog down the rest of the ecosystem would be a great relief, I think, to the whole industry. And then as I contemplate, people keep talking about, you know, how are you going to validate feasibility and scalability? It strikes me that the way we've talked about it, or Carequality does it today, you know, let's get some volunteers to try things out. It almost feels like you need a parallel process, not that the funding's there for it yet, where you would have a diverse sample of the ecosystem sort of testing and vetting both what you can do today and what you can do with emerging standards, and what that design, what the array of that design might look like across not only a local region, but with you know, remote players in some respect that's almost happening in parallel to the evolution of the final framework, if you will.
Okay, thanks. All right, I do believe we have still 9 minutes before we get kicked off the stage. And this is helpful. You know, we were joking a little bit about the questions that we had intended to ask, but we are taking notes on everything that folks are saying, and what we'll be able to do is we'll actually map the comments back to the questions that we had meant to ask, because most of them actually do slot in somewhere. I really appreciate all the feedback. That said, I do want to get briefly here to message delivery and just get some initial thoughts. So in addition to QHIN Query, The MRTCs specify a sort of parallel. The query is a pull. There's also a push QHIN messaging paradigm that is envisioned called QHIN message delivery. Again, as with QHIN query, the MRTCs themselves really just say, there needs to be this capability to do a push model. In the QTF Draft 1, the straw proposal for a standard for this was XCDR. The question was asked actually from ONC of whether XDR or some other possibilities, that there may be some FHIR-based ways that we could approach QHIN message delivery. Interested, and Dave, I'll ask you to elaborate a little bit on XCDR and XDR, but interested in what the community's thoughts are on the specification that we should be looking at for this QHIN message delivery paradigm.
For those who don't follow IHE standards as closely as you should. XCDR is fairly new. It was put together in 2016. It's had a few revisions since then. It's out for trial implementation. What it is cross-community document exchange through reliable interface. So what you have is the old standard XDR, which is very much point-to-point. It was designed around if you have a document sharing system and somebody else's document sharing system, this is a way using email or other reliable interchange method. Matter of fact, XDR became the basis for direct. I'm sure some of you care about that. And that's wonderful, and it's straightforward, it's well implemented. XCDR was designed around the whole concept of cross-community, the way XCA was. So it really is, in a major way, provide and register ITI 41 for those who are geeks like me at the cross-community exchange. This, of course, is in trial implementation. It's not part of the IHE technical framework yet because, of course, it's still being tested and still being worked out. However, it is really designed for the cross-community, using the home community IDs, using the ability to route through a cross-community session. So very different usage, but not well implemented, right? It's not out there. It's not part of your Epic systems. It's not part of your HIE systems to a large extent. Some have actually put it out there, which is always nice to see. But XDR is everywhere. And like we said, one of the reasons we're going with SOAP-based transactions is because it's everywhere. Should we mandate the XCDR, though? Because it is designed around cross-community. It will make routing much easier because it does have the home community ID baked in, far better than the XDR standard does. But this means that all of your software developers will go crazy having to implement XCDR, the XCDR profile, which I'm a big fan of, but I have reasons for that.
ITI 41 is delicious, and it might catch fire in California soon. So we've started. Epic, we've built the triggers. We're using ITI 41 through the health exchange, sending it to another participant. The discharge triggers from the hospital, emergency room, ambulatory encounters. No more V2, no more orders interfaces, no more find the direct address, just send it to them. I'm all for it. I mean, less constraints better, but I just want to say that I think it's going to start taking off. We're working with Eric Heflin and Paul Matthews from OCHIN and Stephen Lane. This is going to be a topic for our next RUG meeting. I think that's a great way to go, and I just want to say I'm a big proponent. And I think it's great, and I think the vendors are all going to be able to support it.
Scott?
Why? So
I'm shocked that you have an opinion.
Yeah, what a surprise. So there's actually a whole lot of transactions already flowing from a push standpoint in the organizations that we represent. So 200,000 organizations are exchanging, roughly 1 billion transactions so far via direct. There are some issues with direct, some stuff we've got to deal with, I think, as there are issues with query-based exchange. But I think if we're going to replace direct with something, I think it would be smarter to replace with FHIR. That's my personal opinion. I think that when we replace it with FHIR, we're going to need the same sort of trust framework that direct trust represents. We're going to need to know who the endpoints are. They're going to need to be identity proofed. We're going to need to have a way of being sure that they are who they say they are. And using certificate-based approaches to solving that problem, I mean, I think everybody in the room has an understanding certificates are important for security. The model that Direct uses 2 certificates, and the sender knows that only the recipient can decrypt their message. So this is, I think, it isn't a brand new, shiny thing, but it is the thing that we have, and it actually is working very well. And we don't see any reason why we'd replace this with something else. The only good reason to do it is so the vendors can sell a new interface, as near as I can tell, because there isn't really any reason to replace something that already works. And the more we use Direct, the cheaper it'll get, because this is true of everything you use, right? So people, proclaim that it's too expensive, perhaps. It has a cost associated with the certificate. But frankly, if we were all getting access to certificate-based identities, all endpoints, all individuals, they'd get cheaper, just the same way as everything else that gets more ubiquitous gets cheaper. So I don't think we should be throwing this baby out with the bathwater, not just because I'm the Direct Trust CEO.
That was not my intent. I'm just saying on top of, we are using ITI 41. I think it's great. I think it's underutilized. I still think the issues that we have with Direct are about directory management and the maintenance of those, which is right now, given the fact that somewhere in the Cures Act we're supposed to have the directory, that would be great, but we don't.
So we have 15 of the top 20 EHRs coming to a meeting next week to discuss the healthcare directory ecosystem inside of Direct Trust. We know this is a problem. We take it as our responsibility to fix, but we're going to need the EHR vendors as support for it, because a lot of the issues come from the edge.
Bill, you get the last word.
All right. So maybe this is a good way to end. So the goal of the TEFCA is to get a single on-ramp for all the providers, right? That's kind of the stated goal. And the stats that they have in the preamble, are like 80% of the hospitals and 50% of the ambulatory clinics or something like that. So and those stats are from a couple of years ago. And with all the progress that's been made with Carequality and Health Exchange and Commonwealth and everything, I guess I'm trying to figure out, as we answer these questions about FHIR versus SOAP versus this, what's the goal? Are we just trying to get from 80% of the hospitals to 99 and then 50% of the ambulatory? Or in which case you would say, hey, the path we're on maybe is not that bad, just get everyone else to use those same standards. Or is the path that we're trying to redo what's been there? And I guess I think will help the decision about FHIR versus SOAP would help if you can define what the goal is. That's mine.
I really like the way you frame that, and I think what my first blush sort of response to it, and I would reserve the right to think about this a little bit more, but my initial response to it is that there's a reason why Carequality is still pointing at those ancient IHE versions. It's because once something is out there, it gets really hard to change it. Not that you can't ever, but it's pretty painful when you really want to fully upgrade the underlying stack. And so as we look at this being in place, Ryan made the point, I think, that we're going to be in this transition period over a course of 10 years. Over a course of 10 years, is it worth it to make an investment right now I asked this question without having an answer in mind. I think this is the question. Is it worth it to make an investment right now in a new technology, a different approach, a new set of specs beyond what's already in use, in order to actually get 10 years of efficient, lower cost maintenance of interfaces, ultimately is what it comes down to? Or is there just really not that much difference? Is it going to not be less complex? Should we just go with what's out there? The other 15% that we want to add, you know what? You can be added. Just implement the damn specs, and maybe that's the answer. But I think that's a way that I would frame it in response to how you had.
just to add on to that, and you know I'm a big supporter of doing what works today, but I can't, I would be doing a disservice if I didn't parrot back what we hear every day in our work. Usability, usability, usability. Providers are dying from the CCDAs. So I think that if our point is to get providers to be able to use the technology to truly improve better healthcare, which means by definition we have to take, in my opinion, we have to take advantage of emerging technology like FHIR that will get providers the information that's really usable in a more digestible format. So that's my main, yes, we've got to do what works in Carequality and eHealth Exchange today, but we cannot lose sight of usability on the provider side.
Thank you. Good comment to end on. So really appreciate the feedback. We're learning how we conduct these sessions, and we'll think about how we can in the webinar target some of the more detailed questions that we really do need answers to. But this was more general feedback, I think, and it's really useful and I think important to think through some of the questions that are raised, and we did ultimately get feedback on many of the most important questions that we had. So thank you very much. I think now Mary Ann's going to come up and I'll turn it over to her.